I always knew my Aunt Denise had a problem with me. What I didn't know, until the night of my own wedding, was exactly how far she was willing to go to make that problem everyone else's business too. My name is Rachel. I'm 29, and 6 months ago, I married the love of my life, Adam, in a small vineyard venue 2 hours outside the city. It was supposed to be the best day of my life. For about 4 hours. It actually was. To understand why my aunt did what she did, you have to understand the family she came from. And the family I almost didn't get to have. My mother, Linda, and my Aunt Denise are sisters, only 14 months apart, raised by parents who, by every account I've heard from relatives who were around back then, played favorites without a shred of subtlety. My grandmother adored Denise. The older, more traditionally successful daughter who married young, had the big house, the country club membership, the polished life. My mother, meanwhile, was the difficult one. She left home at 19, worked her way through community college as a single mother after my father left when I was 2, and built a modest but honest life as a school administrator. Growing up, I felt the temperature difference every time our 2 branches of the family were in a room together. Denise's kids, my cousins Trevor and Amanda, got the new bikes, the Disney trips, the effusive praise at every family gathering. My mother and I got polite nods and the occasional comment about how resourceful we were, which even as a kid, I understood wasn't really a compliment. I don't think Aunt Denise ever set out to be cruel to us directly. It was subtler than that. A lifetime of small comparisons, of, well, when Trevor got into state, and Amanda's fiancé is a surgeon, you know, dropped into conversations like little pins. My mother absorbed most of it with a patience I still don't fully understand. I absorbed less patiently. By the time I was in my 20s, I'd built a relationship with Aunt Denise that consisted mostly of forced pleasantries at holidays and a private vow to keep my adult life as far from her opinions as possible. Then I met Adam. Adam is, by any reasonable measure, a wonderful partner, kind, steady, a civil engineer with a dry sense of humor that took me a full year of dating to fully appreciate. We got engaged after 3 years together, and I remember calling my mother first, practically shaking with happiness. I remember, too, the strange knot in my stomach when I realized I'd eventually have to tell Aunt Denise. Her reaction, when it came, was polished on the surface and pointed underneath. "An engineer," she said at a family dinner, in a tone that somehow managed to make the word sound like a consolation prize. "Well, Amanda's Marcus is a cardiothoracic surgeon, but I suppose every family has different priorities." "AV do us different." I let it go. I let a lot of things go, in the months of wedding planning that followed, because my mother kept reminding me that weddings bring out the worst in extended families, and the goal was simply to survive the day with as much peace as possible. What I didn't know, what none of us knew until 3 weeks before the wedding, was that Aunt Denise had spent those months of forced pleasantries quietly digging for something she could use. The something she found involved my father. My biological father, Richard, left when I was 2, and beyond a handful of blurry childhood memories and one strained lunch when I was 16 that neither of us particularly enjoyed, I'd had almost no relationship with him. My mother had remarried when I was 7. My stepfather, Gary, was the man who actually raised me, coached my soccer team, walked me down the aisle at my wedding. Richard was, for all practical purposes, a stranger with my last name attached. What I didn't know was that Richard had a second family I'd never been told about. A wife and 2 children in another state, a fact my mother had known for years, but had deliberately kept from me, not out of some grand deception, but because, in her words later, it was his mess to explain, not mine to carry for you. She'd made peace with it as a strange footnote to her own painful history, and hadn't thought it was information that would improve my life to carry around. Aunt Denise found out about Richard's second family through a mutual acquaintance, a few months before the wedding, and instead of coming to my mother or me with it privately, instead of handling it like a normal human being with a shred of compassion, she apparently decided it was the perfect piece of ammunition for a moment when it would do the most damage. She waited until my wedding reception, until the toasts, until nearly 200 guests, including Adam's entire extended family meeting, most of mine for the first time, were seated with glasses raised, waiting for something warm and celebratory. Instead, Aunt Denise stood up, tapped her glass for silence, and said the words that would blow apart what had been, until that exact second, the happiest day of my life. "I think," she said, smiling in a way I'd later realize was rehearsed, "before we go any further celebrating this family, some people in this room deserve to know the truth about where it actually comes from." The room went quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when everyone senses something is about to go wrong, but nobody yet knows what. I remember gripping Adam's hand under the table so hard he later told me it left a mark. Aunt Denise continued, her voice pitched for maximum reach across the reception hall. "Rachel likes to present this whole lovely, wholesome image of her family," she said. "But I think everyone here should know that her father, Richard, has an entire second family he's kept hidden for over 20 years. A wife, 2 kids, living just a few states away, this whole time, while Rachel's mother acted like their little broken family was some kind of noble struggle." She paused, letting that land, before adding the final twist of the knife. "I just think, on a day about honesty and vows, we shouldn't be building celebrations on top of secrets. I want to tell you, I had some composed, dignified response in that moment. I didn't. I sat there, frozen, feeling 200 pairs of eyes swivel toward my table, feeling my new mother-in-law's hand come to rest, gently, on my shoulder from where she sat one seat over. A small gesture of support that somehow made the humiliation worse, because it confirmed that this really was happening, in front of everyone. My mother stood up so fast her chair nearly toppled. For a second, I thought she was going to cry, or shout, or do any of the things I might have expected from a woman who had just been publicly ambushed with a fact about her ex-husband she'd spent 2 decades quietly protecting her daughter from. Instead, something in her face shifted into a kind of calm I'd never seen before. The calm of someone who has spent 30 years being underestimated by the same person and has finally run out of patience for it. "Denise," my mother said, her voice carrying without needing to shout, "since we're doing this here, in front of everyone, let's actually do this." Aunt Denise's smile flickered, just slightly. "Linda, I don't think." "You don't think?" my mother repeated. "That's interesting, because you clearly thought quite a lot about bringing this up tonight, of all nights. So let's talk about secrets, since you brought it up." What happened over the next several minutes was not something either my mother or I had planned. My mother told me later she genuinely intended to let the whole ugly episode with Richard fade after the wedding, the way she always had. But something about watching her sister weaponize her daughter's wedding day broke a dam that had been holding for 30 years. My mother explained calmly to a silent room that she'd known about Richard's second family for over a decade. That she'd kept it from me not out of shame, but out of a mother's instinct to protect her child from a wound that wasn't hers to carry. And then, before Denise could recover her footing, my mother said the sentence that changed the entire trajectory of the evening. "But if we're airing family secrets tonight, Denise, I think there's one a little closer to home that you might want to sit back down for." The color drained from my aunt's face in a way I will genuinely never forget as long as I live. My mother went on to explain, carefully, without theatrics, in a voice that somehow made it worse than shouting would have, that 3 years earlier, our grandmother, before she passed away, had quietly changed her will to leave a larger share of the family's modest estate to my mother, specifically because she'd finally, in her final years, come to recognize the imbalance she'd created between her daughters throughout their lives, and wanted to correct it in whatever small way she still could. Aunt Denise, upon learning this, had gone to the estate lawyer directly, without telling my mother, without any of the family present, and had quietly, methodically worked to have the will contested on grounds of diminished capacity, despite the fact that our grandmother's doctors had documented no such thing. It had taken my mother nearly a year and several $1,000s in legal fees to fight off a challenge that Denise had never once discussed with her directly, all while Denise continued showing up to family dinners, smiling, as though nothing was happening beneath the surface. You spent a year trying to prove our mother wasn't of sound mind in her final year of life, my mother said, so that you could take money she specifically wanted to go to me, after everything you'd already been given throughout our entire childhood, and you want to stand here tonight and talk to me about secrets? I rue is. The silence that followed
Aunt Denise
was the loudest thing I have
that.
ever experienced
I
in
watched
my
her
life.
open her mouth twice, searching for something.
A defense. A deflection. The same kind of polished comment she'd used my entire life to needle my mother without ever quite crossing a line she couldn't walk back. But there was no walking this back. Not in a room full of 200 witnesses, several of whom I'd learn later were mutual family friends who had absolutely no idea about the will dispute and were visibly stunned. My cousin Amanda, Denise's own daughter, was one of them. I watched her face from across the room, a mixture of confusion and dawning horror, as she processed what her mother had apparently done to my grandmother's estate without ever mentioning a word of it to her own children. Aunt Denise sat down without another word. Not gracefully. She practically collapsed into her chair, the performance completely drained out of her, replaced by something that looked, for the first time in my life, like actual shame. She left the reception less than 20 minutes later, without saying goodbye to me, to my mother, or to anyone else at our table. I wish I could tell you the rest of the wedding went perfectly after that. It didn't, not exactly. There's no version of a public family implosion at your own reception that doesn't leave a mark on the evening. But something strange happened in the hour that followed. Guests who had been stiff and unsure how to react slowly started coming up to my mother, one by one, not to gossip, but to quietly tell her how sorry they were that she'd carried that burden alone, and how much they respected the grace she'd shown in finally setting the record straight. Adam, for his part, held my hand through the entire thing, and later told me that watching my mother stand up for herself in that moment was, in a strange way, one of the things that made him fall even more in love with the family he was marrying into, not because of the drama, but because of what it revealed about the woman who raised me. May. In the months since the wedding, my relationship with Aunt Denise has essentially ended, not through some dramatic final confrontation, but through a mutual, unspoken understanding that whatever thin civility had held our family together for 3 decades had finally run out. My cousin Amanda, interestingly, reached out to me privately about a month later, not to defend her mother, but to apologize on her behalf, and to admit that she'd had no idea how deep the resentment toward my mother had run over the years. We've slowly started rebuilding something like a real friendship since then, something that never really existed when our mother's rivalry cast a shadow over every family gathering. As for my relationship with my mother, it's become something I didn't know it could be. For years, I'd quietly resented her for never standing up to Denise, for absorbing decades of casual cruelty with what I mistook for weakness, rather than what I now understand was simply exhausted patience, watching her finally set that record straight, not out of spite, but because she genuinely had enough, taught me something about her strength I wish I'd understood decades earlier. My father, Richard, actually reached out to me for the first time in years after word of the wedding reached him through a mutual relative. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. We've had exactly 2 brief, somewhat awkward phone calls since, and I doubt we'll ever have the relationship some part of me once wished for. But even that small crack of communication, strange as it is, came out of the wreckage of that one terrible toast. Looking back, I understand now that Aunt Denise walked into my wedding reception believing she held all the power in that room, that she alone knew a secret capable of humiliating us in front of everyone we loved. What she didn't understand, what she never bothered to consider in all her scheming, was that my mother had been quietly absorbing far worse from her for years, and had simply been waiting, without ever planning to, for the moment when silence finally stopped being worth it. She tried to expose a secret to destroy my wedding day. Instead, she exposed exactly who she'd always been, and finally, after 30 years, everyone in that room got to see it too.